It's certainly challenging times for land conservation. And we did celebrate reaching the 2030, 30% by 2030 goal. The state set a goal to protect 30% of the landscape by 2030, which is going along with this idea that we should be protecting about half of the landscape to ensure biodiversity and climate resilience. And the state set this goal 30 by 30, 30% by 2030, and met it ahead of schedule last year. Fast forward less than a year, and the state's in a budget crunch. We all knew it was going to be in a budget crunch, and these land conservation programs have really taken a serious haircut. Program open space, which is something I think every Marylander should be aware of. Every time you purchase a piece of real estate, you pay a half of 1% in transfer tax, and that money goes back to program open space. I think the bargain being that when we develop something or sell some piece of real estate, we protect the landscape with some sliver of that transactional cost. And over the years, that 0.5% has really funded some of the most iconic land preservation in the state. And it's a program that I would say a lot of states would love to have. They're not fortunate enough, and we created it decades ago, and it's done a lot of good. In fact, I would argue the fact that we can say we've achieved 30 by 30 is singularly because of program open space. And it funds, just for your listeners' sake, program open space stateside conservation easements, which we do a lot of. It also funds the Rural Legacy Program, which we also do a lot of. And it also funds the Maryland Ag Land Preservation Foundation, or MALPF, which is a very popular easement out on the landscape for agricultural production. So I would say the best conservation programs, land conservation programs we've got in the state of Maryland are funded by program open space. And it just in the budget passed yesterday, we see it get cut by $25 million a year for the next 4 years. So it's a $100 million cut. And that's a lot of acreage to protect that we're taking off the table. It is a lot of landowners that have been waiting in line for a long time that are going to have to wait a little longer. But it's better than the initial proposal from the Department of Legislative Services, which was to zero out program open space for that same time period. And anything that we stopped doing for 4 years, we've essentially stopped doing. Right? When something goes away for that long, it's hard to pick back up again. So we defeated that proposal. And I would say we're prepared to take a haircut. We knew we could read the room, knew that where the state budget was headed, and knew we were going to take a substantial cut to conservation funding. I would argue this is a little deeper than we thought. It's certainly not equitable to what came out of other pots of conservation funding or other state priorities. But we are going to fight again next session to see if we can't get some commitment to restore this funding from the governor, the legislature, whomever that may be. Program open space is real hard to track in that way. So it's almost impossible to explain quickly or easily because the state predicts what it's going to take in from this transfer tax, puts that much funding in, and when they are above that, then that's over-attainment, and some of the money gets clawed back. When they under-attain, it's just sort of a very complicated mix. But we estimate that, and the DNR estimates that there's about $130 million in the program open space reserve account right now, stateside reserve account. So this won't touch that. This is new funding coming into the program. And in the first couple years of this cut, it's going to be very dramatic. The hope is that after you get through kind of some of this complicated arithmetic, the cut will be less deep in future years. But the simple fact of the matter is we are taking $100 million from land conservation over the next 4 years. And when you consider that the average cost of a conservation easement per acre, it's a lot of conservation being taken off the table. And I would say The opportunity to protect a farm or a forest or a property is when that landowner is willing to do it. And that doesn't necessarily, that feeling, that opportunity doesn't exist for 4 years potentially. It exists now. And some of this funding is also used for state acquisition, fee title acquisition. So when the state wants to buy a piece of property for a park or a wildlife management area or a boat ramp, they can utilize these funds for that as well. And I would say the time to buy is when it's for sale. You really don't have that flexibility in purchasing something. So again, $100 million coming off the table for conservation at a time when we see, as we've talked about here before, the pressures on this landscape are higher than ever before. And I feel like I say that every time I come in and talk to you, that the pressures now are higher than they were 6 months ago and a year ago and 18 months ago. I think it'll be substantial because I think the counties are facing, not related to conservation necessarily, and I always say conservation has been asked to provide funding back to the state budget, even though conservation is not the reason why we're in this budget crunch. And that's certainly true of the counties as well. Queen Anne's County has really done a visionary job of matching conservation dollars. Rural Legacy, Maryland Ag Land Preservation Foundation, really sort of enviable that few other counties can do that or have made that same commitment. And I think that it's going to be tougher to do that in the future, both because of the costs of governing that are now to be borne by the counties as the state passes these costs along in some ways to the counties, and also because there's just going to be less funding for these programs coming from the state. I think the next fiscal year 2026 appropriations process is going to be pretty interesting to see. And that's one that Congress is starting now. And there are any number of federal programs that support conservation on the Eastern Shore. We use the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. We use Chesapeake Wild. We use Regional Conservation Partnership Program funding, which is from the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill has expired. I am not sure what reauthorization of that looks like in this current Congress, and I'm not sure what a full-year funding bill looks like from this Congress either. So the question becomes, does Congress formally pull back from conservation funding? And that will certainly have an impact. And it creates kind of a perfect storm, right, where you see a sort of a philosophical pullback at the federal level, and then you see just a realpolitik budgeting pullback at the state level. And it creates a situation where some of this work just is not going to get done. And it's going to set back conservation years. The bigger picture for us at this moment in time is the pressure on the landscape that I mentioned before. And the fact that these cuts really couldn't come at a worse time for conservation, because there's a lot of angst about solar siting policy. The Maryland General Assembly just passed a bill that essentially takes local land use out of the equation on solar siting. And ESLC fought this bill with a lot of other people, had some changes made to it. It now includes this kind of cutoff or relief valve that when every county has a priority protection area that they've identified as part of their comprehensive plan. And so this is an admission by each of our counties that the agricultural landscape is an important part of their economy and the regional economy and their quality of life and well-being. And so they identify these priority preservation areas. And this law that's been passed now by the General Assembly, awaiting the governor's signature, will say that once we've put solar on 5% of the priority preservation areas, the counties will be able to claw back some of their authority to control, to say yes or no to where solar goes in their county. That's county-wide, or I should say Eastern Shore-wide, that's a 54,000 acre number, which is really, really close, just happens to be, to the number of acres that ESLC has protected with a conservation easement. And it took us 35 years to do that. Yeah. And it's frustrating to think that what we have worked, not the same acres, I don't want to confuse anybody. Conservation easement acres are not on the table for solar. But for the same amount of land that we protected on the one hand to potentially be under a solar panel on the other. And that's a pretty frustrating thing to think about. I think making agriculture the loser in many ways, because there's nobody whose future is more uncertain right now than agriculture. When you think about the tariffs that have been proposed, when you think about the cost of inputs, the cost of diesel fuel, the cost of land, it's a difficult time to try and plan for the future as a farmer. And the one thing that they simply cannot do without is the landscape is at scale, a productive landscape at scale that's sort of predictably available to farmers. And it's been difficult to try to convey that to decision makers in Annapolis. We have a lot of decision makers and very few people generally who understand how local land use decisions get made. And local land use decision making on the Western Shore is dramatically different than it is over here, where we have small towns, rural landscapes, agriculture, trying to protect that economy as well. And as a result, when people who don't always understand the details of how this stuff works are making decisions, sometimes you can wind up with some pretty short-sighted policies. And I think it's important to say, we're not anti-solar. We're not anti-solar in farm fields. I think it's got to be done responsibly, and there's got to be some end in sight. I've probably said on this couch before, we've already lost a lot of farmland, and I'm not sure how much more we can bear and continue to have Maryland be, agriculture be the number one business in the state, the number one industry in the state is agriculture. And for every dollar in agricultural production, we see $7 in economic multipliers in the community. To not have agriculture in these communities, or to have it even be degraded economically substantially, would be a major problem. And that goes to say for conservation and natural resources as well. We just put out a report back in the wintertime that was covered in the Talbot Spy about the economic impact of conservation of natural resources. And we saw that the natural resources economy on Delmarva, which is all of the Maryland counties from Cecil down to Somerset, 2 counties of Delaware and a county in Virginia, is worth $8.1 billion every year. That's economic activity. That's people buying bait, right? It's people buying binoculars, paying a fishing guide, staying a night at a bed and breakfast in Tillman Island, booking a charter fishing guide. $8.1 billion a year. And that is an economy worth protecting with public policy. And the way you protect that economy with public policy is investing in the programs that it depends on. And those are land conservation, restoration accounts, water quality projects, and any number of other things, healthy forests. It really requires as I like to say, there's no other business sector where the government is kind of as silent as it is on as natural resource conservation. It's something I think that it gives the economics, it gives very little thought to. The simple fact of the matter is there are a lot of people on the Eastern Shore making their living in conservation. And it's not just people like me who can talk about conservation as practitioners. It's people operating heavy equipment. It's people driving dump trucks. It's people navigating barges. It's just people who speak the language of labor, I like to say. Blue collar folks that are putting their kids through school with a job restoring living shorelines or building wetlands. That's who we have to remember in these types of situations. When we cut these programs, it hurts everywhere.